Okay, today we're going to talk about Mycenae, and we'll see if we can get it all done in one go. Um, and with the city of Mycenae, we'll be talking about the Mycenaean people, this first civilization in the mainland of Greece. Um, so we've talked already about the Minoans, and it's really from the Minoans and their culture that we see the Mycenaeans. They are the best trading customers of the Minoans. They're importing quite a bit of their finished goods, their pottery, stuff like that. Um, and from the Minoans, they borrow things like writing. Lots of architecture and technology flows from Crete into mainland Greece. And by the 15th century, we see actually a fusion of these cultures. The Mycenaeans, it turns out, conquered the Minoans and really brought them under their umbrella of civilization. So we mentioned that they borrowed a lot, and perhaps it's worth an example. Uh, so here we have the famous Minoan pot on the right and the Mycenaean pot on the left. And it looks pretty clear that the Mycenaeans are drawing quite a bit of inspiration from the Minoans. This pattern, by the way, is extremely common throughout history. The Romans are going to borrow very heavily from the Greeks. Um, and this isn't to say that the Mycenaeans are somehow um, less because they borrow technology. There's no point in reinventing the wheel if someone already has it. The Greeks are going to take the alphabet from the Phoenicians later. Um, and the fact of the matter is, we all stand on the shoulders of the generations who came before us. And this isn't a slight on the Mycenaeans. It simply helps us establish where did Mycenaean custom and culture pull influence? Why do we see this continuity? So in the city of Mycenae itself, this town in the Peloponnesus, we have the ruins of the city. And perhaps most importantly, we have several burial sites. And these are great for archaeologists because burial sites help us understand the people. So we have two types of graves in the city of Mycenae, well, in and around. The first and the earlier set of graves are called shaft graves. And you can see on the picture in the top left corner there that they were dug, it was a shaft that was dug into the ground, and people were lowered into these slots that were dug out of the shaft and buried there with various artifacts. And we see a variety of social rank, and we see a difference in societal wealth with the bodies. And this actually culminates in the tholos, or beehive graves. And you see an artist's reconstruction there on the right. On the bottom left there are some of the gold artifacts that were recovered from these burial sites. And from these, we learned quite a bit. So let's look at the shaft graves first. So this is actually in within the walls of Mycenae itself, unlike the Tholos graves, which are located outside. Um, and these early shaft graves show a rising amount of stuff. So from this, we can see that the Mycenaeans started more simply and become richer and more powerful as time goes on. The second type of grave, the Tholos grave, they are huge in size. They are extremely expensive. We have to imagine that only the richest and most powerful kings ever could have afforded to build essentially these underground pyramids almost, except they're beehives, they're round. But these huge structures with these great big stones, and then they bury them. Unfortunately, like the pyramids, they've all been robbed. Well, nearly all of them. There was one that had some stuff left. So this makes it hard for us to get the level of detail that we would like, but the structures themselves do show quite a bit. So here you can actually see sort of a bit of scale. That's my mother. She's walking into one of these Tholos tombs. Here is another Tholos grave. Unfortunately, the top has been eroded away over time, so we don't get the full height, but you can see my brother there, who's actually taller than me. He's 6'2". These were big structures, and it took a lot of man hours of labor to construct these things, and they're a real testament to the power, this first great civilization of Greece, to the power that they wielded to build these colossal tombs. Now, like Troy, Mycenae was uncovered by Heinrich Schliemann, and this is great since we now know the city exists, but not so great because Heinrich Schliemann isn't the most honest of archaeologists. Famously, this is the time where he ordered a goldsmith to bring some gold, don't tell anyone he's coming, and unveils the face of Agamemnon. We're pretty skeptical about this. Those twirling mustachios are dubious, and no one will let scientists test this mask to see if it's actually historically valid. But after discovering this, Heinrich Schliemann sent a letter to the king of Greece where he famously says, "I have gazed upon the face of your ancestor, I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon," which is kind of funny if you think about it, because the then king of Greece actually wasn't even Greek, so no. And we have no evidence that Agamemnon actually was real. But that's not the point. Heinrich Schliemann, who lived from 1822 to 1890, kickstarted the dig at Mycenae. So, we mentioned writing a little earlier. Let's circle back around to that. The Mycenaeans wrote in a script that Sir Arthur Evans, an archaeologist, calls Linear A. And he also found a separate script at his digs in Crete that he dubbed Linear B. He could tell that there were two separate scripts, couldn't read them, so gave them the very colorful and memorable names A and B. And it's linear because they wrote them in lines. We were able to break the code of Linear B in the 1950s. There was actually he was an architect, no formal archaeological training at all, man by the name of Michael Ventris. And he, just for fun, decided he was going to crack the code, and he discovered that it is, in fact, Greek, the Linear B script. But it's a syllabic alphabet, which means that each syllable has its own letter, which makes reading way harder. You have so many more letters to keep track of. But the word, for example, tripod, which for us requires 6 characters, would only require 3 in Linear B. One for t, one for ri, one for po. Tiripo. That's Greek for tripod. So we have lots of these tablets, and they say all kinds of things. Mostly they're lists of government documents. Sometimes they're inventories. Sometimes they're lists of individual property. We know, for example, that one farmer had 2 cows, one named Spot and one named Blackie. There we go. We know that now. But also some pretty tantalizing accounts. Things like the sea, or there's enemies off the shore, they are coming. And the tablet was burned and fired into clay because the town it was in was destroyed, which is this terrifying last testament of that town at Pylos. But that comes later. So the Mycenaeans themselves live in these large government palace complexes. They're heavily fortified, unlike the Minoan palaces. We found over 15 of these palace fortresses. And archaeological evidence shows that Greece was fairly heavily populated. It wasn't over carrying capacity yet, but it had a very high population, which shows the level of prosperity that these Mycenaeans enjoyed. And the centers of their civilization were with these government complexes, these palaces. So in the Mycenaean language, the word for king is wanax. In Greek, for example, in the Iliad, we hear Agamemnon being called Onyx. They drop the W sound. So that's what we would expect to see wanax translated as. Interestingly enough, the word Onyx is going to disappear, and kings will then be called basileus, which means mayor in the Mycenaean world. So it's an interesting sort of downgrade. We'll talk about that later. But these heavily fortified palaces show lots of Minoan influence in the way that we have this centrally organized system. Um, and these palaces would control the surrounding area. They would bring in all of the crops. They would run all of the specialists. They commanded the economy. And they controlled all of the surrounding territory. Unlike later Greek city-states, we're going to see much larger areas of control. But at the same time, we still would expect there to be some degree of infighting, some degree of feuding between some of these palaces. So it's better to think of the Mycenaeans perhaps as a confederation as opposed to a unified culture. So that's worth considering. So the social structure of the Mycenaeans was very hierarchical. You have social ranks. You have the Wanax on top, you have the palace elite, the warrior caste, you have the skilled craftsmen, and then you have the low farmers and slaves. We'll talk a little bit about slavery in the ancient world later. It's an ugly truth that existed, and it's worth looking at and giving a little bit more time to discuss later. So I'm going to gloss over that now with the understanding that we'll revisit it. So the Mycenaean world was very bureaucratic. You have government officials who count, catalog, and organize all this stuff. You have feudal is anachronistic. It's not quite correct, but it's a good framework to think about this, where you have the Wanax, the war chief, the high king, and under him you have the basileia, who control smaller areas, and they have underneath them bureaucrats who answer to them. And it's also worth noting that, like today, social status was marked in a large degree by wealth. Well, how do you know you're important? Look at all the stuff I have. Look at these gold cups. This shows that I'm important. Kind of like a sports car or a private jet today, right? They're social markers. So trade in this ancient world was very important. No one part of the Mediterranean had all the things they needed, so they had to swap with neighbors. And this ancient Bronze Age had a vibrant and rich trade system. We have Mycenaean olive oil with perfume in it and these little containers. It's actually worth reflecting that the ancient world didn't have soap, so if you wanted to get clean, this perfumed olive oil was the way to go. A world without soap is terrifying to think about. Anyway, so Mycenaeans are trading out olive oil, cloth, pottery, worked bronze, wine was a big one, and they brought in lots of raw materials, but also luxury goods. Remember, the way you show you're important is by the stuff that you have, and nothing says you're important like rich, exotic, foreign stuff. Look at this fancy scarab amulet I have out of Egypt. Ooh, bet you don't have one of those. See how awesome I am. So that was an important part of this Mycenaean trade system. Political life. The Mycenaeans are sort of on the edge of this ancient Eastern Mediterranean trade world. Greece is very rocky, it's hard to get to. No one's really invading the Mycenaeans because, have you tried trying to get through Greece and all the fortresses are fortified? It's a mess, it's not really worth it. So the Mycenaeans are invading out, but they're not really getting invaded themselves, at least not by outsiders yet. We have Hittite records that talk about the Ahiwaya, or the Achaeans. That's what Homer calls the ancient Greeks. And we have messages that talk about a dispute between them and Wilusa, which is in that Troy area we talked about earlier. The Mycenaeans had a very important warrior caste. They were far more militaristic than say, the ancient Egyptians or the Minoans. Hittites were also quite militaristic, but the Mycenaeans invented these heavy suits of bronze armor that are incredible to look at, though kind of bulky and wouldn't be so great for running around in. But famously, they used chariots, like all Bronze Age societies. We're not really sure how functional they were.